All right, good morning and welcome everyone to the, to the Teacher Educator Interest section for TESOL International. This is our webinar series for the 2023-2024 year, I suppose. And our focus this year for the Teacher Educator intersection is storytelling. Good morning, James, welcome. And Monica and everyone who's here, great. So we're focusing on storytelling this year, using stories in teacher education, using stories with our multilingual learners. And we've had one webinar already on that topic. And today is our second webinar on that topic. And so we're going to dive right in. I'm really glad you all actually heard about this. I know my TESOL is not quite up and running yet, so it's great that you all made it. So our presenter today is Elizabeth Hughes. And Elizabeth has previously worked as an English as a second language teacher in rural Texas public schools. So she comes to us with a ton of experience. And she is also currently pursuing a PhD in linguistics at Texas Tech University. And I'm happy to say that Elizabeth is now ABD, all but dissertation. So congratulations on that. Elizabeth's scholarly interests include language ideologies in education, with a focus on instructional development, the syntactic structure of translingual practices, and the intersection of race, language, and rhetoric. And today she's going to present for us a very interesting webinar, Authentic Voices in Social Media Discourse, hashtag translanguaging, hashtag code switching, hashtag Spanglish, and the hashtag No Sabo Kids. She's going to start with research that explores the relationship between translanguaging and language appropriateness, expectations in the discourse community of TikTok, the frequency and syntactic levels of translanguaging, which vary depending on the tag. And we will also learn practical applications for encouraging pre-service teachers to write with their authentic voices while also protecting their well-being. And so we are super excited to have you all here. Welcome. And I'm going to turn it over to Elizabeth.
Hi, everyone. Yes, I'm very excited, also a little bit nervous, but we'll roll with it. Hopefully my brain can stay focused for this, hour session that we have. I will try my best to stay on point. I'm going to share my screen with you and share my presentation with you. Yeah. So like Heather said, I'm Elizabeth Hughes. I'm from Texas Tech University, that is in West Texas. And I recently passed my qualifying exam, so now I'm officially a PhD candidate, which is pretty exciting. I wanted to start off with a quote. This is from a comment from a de-identified TikTok user. Now, many of the TikTok users are, younger than 18 years old. So just to help protect their identities, I de-identified everyone's comments. So here we have this comment, and it is about mixing languages together. So está bien mezclar, pero we have to do it properly in cada lenguaje. And so the translation of that would be, it is okay, like it's okay, or it's good to mix, but we have to do it properly in each language. And this comment, something to note, I did not change any spelling. I did not add or take away any accent markings or anything like that. So all the comments that you'll see in this presentation are exactly as they appeared in TikTok comments. A quick overview of my presentation today. First, we'll talk about authentic voices in storytelling and what that means by authentic voices. We'll talk about some language ideologies that impact students, how comfortable they feel using their authentic voice in the classroom, whether that is our pre-service teachers in education classes, or whether that's the students that our teachers are preparing to work with. It applies to both. I'll go over my TikTok research methods and the results of that. And we'll talk about the contours of the conversation that's going on in TikTok. And then we'll talk about how we can apply it to languaging in the classroom. Okay, so authentic voices and storytelling. First of all, I just wanted to talk about why do we even tell stories in the classroom? Why is this important? For me, this goes back to my background in rural ESL as the middle school and the high school ESL teacher for a small rural district. And you can hear my Texas accent coming out every time I say the word rural. I would try to say it clearly. Okay. So I was the only ESL teacher for middle school and high school. And this is very normal in small rural districts, no matter what state or setting. So that means that the ESL students, they were my students from 5th grade through 12th grade until they either exited the program or they graduated. Oftentimes, students who are still in ESL by 5th grade, the ones who like started in pre-K and grew up within the entire school district, like their entire educational careers. If they're still in ESL by 5th grade, chances are they're going to still be in ESL by the time they're a senior in high school. And so I had years to develop a really strong rapport with my students. Some of my students, it took that long. But whenever we're working with university students, we only have one semester to really establish that strong relationship with them to the point where they feel safe in the classroom using their authentic voice. And so what that means is that we also need to use our authentic voices in storytelling. But it's not as easy as that or as simple as that. There are many factors that add into this. And so to frame this presentation and to approach some of these factors, I wanted to tell you a story about a student. His name is, we're going to call him Alex. And from what I saw from him, he was a linguistically gifted student, like really gifted at the way he could language. For example, he was a football player because, like rural Texas. And in the hallways, I could hear him talking to his football buddies. And like I knew Alex's voice, but if I really listened to the words that he was using, I wouldn't be able to pick him out from any other monolingual Texas country English speaker. But then he would come into the ESL classroom and he would shift into a very standard academic form of English. And my Spanish is okay. I've been working on it since I was a teenager, but it's not perfect. And he would help me with my Spanish by speaking to me in the Spanish that he knew that I knew, which is very like stilted, awkward textbook Spanish mixed with the North Texas country Spanish variety. And so he knew I knew this variety of Spanish. He would speak to me in that to help me. And we had a newcomer student come in from southern rural Mexico, and she spoke a variety of Spanish that I didn't understand, and she didn't understand me. So he translated for us. He would go from the rural variety of Mexican Spanish to the North Texas variety of country Spanish that he knew that I knew. And so he was shifting between all these different varieties of language, and he was really good at it too. So like he was really good at rhetorical attunement. And this is a term that I've come across recently, and I think it's really cool. So like I have a piano behind me, if you can see that piano, right? So if you tune a piano, then you play a note and then you adjust the strings until the pitch matches that note. But our language is the same way. So if you think about it, Alex, what he was doing is he was listening to his fellow interlocutors, and he was adjusting his language to match them in whatever situation he was in. And he was really good at this. And yet, if I walked down to the front office and pulled his permanent file, he was coded as limited English proficient, which is the term in Texas, LEP. Even though he could hold his own, in the hallway with his football buddies. And he was also coded as a long-term English learner. And in his Spanish classes, he really struggled to pass his Spanish classes because it was a very formal teacher. in a very formal version of written Spanish. And the issue with a lot of rural schools that they have is a lack of funding. So we did not have bilingual funding because we did not have enough students to qualify for it. And so even though Alex was, had been in the school district since he was in pre-K, and he did not qualify for, bilingual, like we didn't have bilingual programs for him. So he could speak Spanish, but he never actually had instruction in Spanish in his life until he got into high school. So we have all these convoluting factors. So, whenever I actually saw Alex in the classroom, he presented very differently than what his paperwork looked like. So for Alex, yeah, I could build this rapport with him, and he was comfortable enough with me after a few years. So when we have students in our classes at the university level, like Alex, who may have had some trauma in their past regarding language in the classroom and the policies in place for that, we do really need to work very hard to make that connection and make this a safe space for them. So that's the background for my research. Some language ideologies that helped get us to this point. Really what I'm talking about here is code switching. And that's technically the definition is, merging two languages together in one utterance. And students like Alex and most of my other students, they did this all the time. So in theoretical linguistics and variationist linguistics, they usually prefer the term code switching. The problem with that is that it denotes that there are separate encapsulated codes to switch between. Jeffrey McSwan cautions against deconstructing those boundaries around named languages because we should be celebrating differences across languages, which is a fair point. Okay. Carol Myers-Scotton, she's my personal favorite. She uses the markedness model. She defines code a little bit differently than McSwan does. She defines the code as the code of language expectations. And so that's really what we're going to be looking at a lot is what are the language expectations within a discourse context, whether it's TikTok or your classroom. She argues that switching from the expected code, that would be the unnoticed or the unmarked code, to one that is inappropriate in some way or seen as inappropriate in some way, makes it marked. And that's the actual switch between codes. She argues that it's a purposeful rhetorical choice and it's not a result of language deficiencies. So whichever perspective you prefer, the common ground is that humans are hardwired to communicate effectively across those differences. More recently, language educators are using the term translanguaging. You've probably heard of this at some point, and it emerged as a specific political stance that deconstructs those monolingual ideologies. The idea that everyone has encapsulated separate languages in their mind. And so that to be bilingual means that you have many monolingual systems in your brain, basically. So these authors, and there are so many authors, so these are just the ones that I first experienced. But there are so many really cool authors doing some really awesome work on this. So they're arguing that these boundaries between languages are socially constructed. And that means that translanguaging denotes, that term translanguaging denotes a natural movement across and sometimes even despite those artificial language boundaries. And what's really cool is this is also emerging in composition and rhetoric studies. So at Texas Tech, I'm housed in the English department. And even over there in the English department, we're still talking about translingual ideologies. And so at Texas Tech, I got to help with the first year writing program. And we created a brand new assignment called the language autoethnography. And so basically the very first thing students do in that required 1301 English class is they write their own language story about how they shift their language varieties depending on the situation. We're trying to build their awareness of that rhetorical attunement that they're really quite good at. When we first piloted this program, we went to some of the veteran teachers in the program, and we asked them to do this pilot for us. And then we interviewed the teachers and the students. And what we found is that the teachers were frustrated because they had all these students who are bilingual. Texas Tech is a Hispanic serving institution, and it's only 5 hours from the border. So we have a lot of students who are heritage speakers of Spanish, and a lot who are fluently bilingual. And we have a lot of international students coming to Tech because it's a big university and it's really cheap cost of living too, right? So in our classes, we have all these bilingual students, but they weren't really talking about their bilingualism. They were making what they thought were safe language choices in this, academic writing assignment. And our teachers were frustrated with this at first. Because, they're like, you have all these cool things you can do with your language and you're not writing about it. But whenever we interviewed the students, what we found is that they were feeling very self-conscious being in, first semester at a university, writing to their peers who they assumed were, maybe being judgmental of them for not writing in standard academic English, which is a very valid point, and they needed to protect themselves. And this is how they did it. So whenever we rolled out the language autoethnography for the whole entire program, we took our brand new teachers. Many of them were teaching for the first semester of their entire lives, and we had a week-long workshop with them where they wrote a language autoethnography. And we really tried to push, write what you feel comfortable writing in the way that you feel comfortable writing it. And if they chose like the safe choices, then that's totally understandable. So for my research, I was really trying to think of like, where are people writing using their authentic voices when they're not quite so self-conscious of it, and they're more willing to take those what they might consider risks of combining languages in writing in like a public forum. A big block or a blockade, maybe, that is affecting students being comfortable using Spanish, especially in US-Mexico border states, has to do with the study by Mena and Garcia in 2021. What they found was that many universities, they are in a location where Spanish has been a domestic language longer than it's been English. At Texas Tech, at UT Rio Grande Valley is where this study comes out of, and many other universities along the border, it's been Spanish longer than English. Right, so Spanish is really a domestic language. And yet many of these universities who market themselves as bilingual universities, they're actually marketing a Spanish as a foreign language variety of Spanish, not the actual local Spanish as being spoken by those language communities. And so that language attitude is really affecting how safe students feel using language, especially if they're heritage speakers of Spanish. Okay, moving on. I could talk about that, for like many hours, and I will try not to. Okay, so for my research, I looked at where can I find a written discourse environment where people are more likely to use their authentic voices. And more importantly, when those language expectations change and they feel like very welcoming, or maybe they feel very judged about mixing languages, how does that actually change the way they do it? And how often they do it, of course, but the way that they mix languages. So I looked at TikTok. TikTok is messy and very difficult to research with, but the benefit of using it has to do with audience design. This goes way back to the 1970s, William Leboff, and then in the 1980s, Alan Bell, not Alexander Bell. I always call him Alexander Bell. That dude invented the telephone. Alan Bell did audience design. And what they found was that whenever people, like you stick a microphone in front of someone, they're not going to use their authentic voice, basically. So it's the researcher's paradox. How do we observe something that people are hesitant to use when they know they're being observed? Alan Bell complicated this even more by thinking about different types of audiences. And this really resonated with me and what I saw from my high school ESL students. They were comfortable with me, so they would be totally comfortable translanguaging in front of me. But then if, a cheerleader walked in to talk to me, because rural Texas, right? Then even if the cheerleader wasn't really listening to them, they would change the way that they were talking. And so it's not just the person that you're talking to, but also like referee audiences, maybe someone who's in the room but not really listening, or someone who might be listening, or someone who might hear later on what I'm saying. So in TikTok, this is pretty cool, because people who post comments on TikTok, they do expect that someone will read it, but at the same time, they expect their comment to just kind of disappear into the TikTokverse and not really be analyzed in such a way. So they're more likely to engage in authentic voices. So I started thinking about, like, what hashtags should I look at? Obviously, translanguaging and code switching. As I was looking at those, I saw an additional tag of Spanglish and ESPANGLISH, which I paired together. And then this last one, I was not expecting. As I was looking through these other tags, the NoSabo kids kept popping up also. And I thought this is a really important place to research. So if you haven't heard of NoSabo kids, technically the correct way to translate or to conjugate saber, to say I don't know, would be no sé, because saber is not a oh my gosh, I forgot the word, not a regular verb. It's an irregular verb. There we go. So it should be no sé. But for a lot of these, teenagers who are heritage speakers of Spanish, who have never really learned, like, this is an irregular verb or this is a regular verb, they might say no sabo instead of no sé. And so no sabo kids is almost a way of making fun of them for this, like, inappropriate use of Spanish. We'll get more into that in a minute, but that's basically what it is. Okay, so overall, here are the total posts per tag. As you can see, NoSabo kids and translanguaging is about equal, with 84, 85 videos, code switching a little bit more with 101 videos, and Spanglish combined is 185. So my research methods. This gets complicated because TikTok is messy, and the algorithms behind TikTok are really convoluted and hard to work with compared to Twitter, or what Twitter used to be, for example. So I use Apify to help kind of sort this and make more sense of it. And I use Apify to collect and organize the top 5 posts for each tag. I also had to define what counts as translanguaging. For example, lexical borrowing would be like the word tortilla. If you ask any monolingual speaker of English, pretty much in the US, what a tortilla is, they could explain it, right? So technically it's a Spanish word, but it has been semantically extended fully into the culture of the US. So for example, if someone wrote, Cafe Chino's makes the best homemade tortillas, I wouldn't count that because those are borrowed words. The other problem with researching on social media in general is I have not yet found a way to pull comments based on just the appearance, or like whether there's more than one language in a comment. So I had to go through and look at every comment and hand scrape each comment. The benefit of that is I got to know the contours of the conversation very well. The drawback to that is I'm a human being, and so I make mistakes. There's going to be a wide margin of error, and this is subject to my own researcher bias. So it's not perfect. With that disclaimer, it's not perfect. We'll move on. I looked for language attitude trends, and then I coded for the syntactic level. So did the meshing of the languages, did that happen for just one word? Or within one word even? Was it a full phrase, or was it an entire sentence? Okay, so the first result I want to talk about is code switching. And the traditional, the theoretical linguistics, code switching is about mixing languages together. But whenever you look at TikTok's hashtag code switching, that's not what it is at all. Instead, it's fully embodied languaging practices. So it's not just the words, but it's the physical, how someone presents. And it's bound up with race a whole lot. And these TikTok users are really brilliant at showing how they're switching between how they present as different races, depending on the situation. And a lot of this has to do with the appropriateness expectations. It's a huge side of discourse for African-American English. And there's a particular focus on appropriateness expectations in the workplace in particular. However, none of the top 5 videos produced the theoretical linguistics idea of code switching, which is really interesting. And I think that's because in theoretical linguistics, that embodied languaging practice isn't part of it. So really what this means is there's a need for more studies that better reflect the current usage of the term code switching. There are a lot of really awesome scholars studying AAE, and scholars who are looking at like the intersection of race and language. Jonathan Rosa is one. His book, Looking Like a Language, Sounding Like a Race, is pretty awesome. You should check that out. But we definitely need more studies that bridge into theoretical linguistics also. Okay, so none of those code switching comments had English and Spanish. So I'm just going to look at languaging or translanguaging, Spanglish, Spanglish, and the no sabo kids. In this chart, the most important part to look at is over here in the right-hand column. This is a percentage of the comments that have translanguaging in them. And so you'll notice that for hashtag translanguaging, that's the most, almost 40% is a pretty good chunk of the comments use translanguaging. Spanglish is lower than that, but then the no sabo kids, the one that's the most judgmental, barely any, right? Not very much at all. So that already tells us that whenever we're working with our students in the classroom, our attitude towards their language use and also the attitude of everyone in the classroom will affect how much they mesh languages together. All right. Hashtag translanguaging. So most of these are from language educators. Dr. Jose Medina is my absolute favorite. If you have not seen any of his videos or followed him on TikTok, you should. He is awesome. Okay, so they post videos with positive attitudes generally in the comments. For example, I have 2 example comments here. I like to picture it as it being translanguaging as thought bubbles. Translanguaging is like un gran círculo de palabras of various languages mezclados conjuntos. So it's basically saying translanguaging is like a big circle of words of various languages that are all mixed together. And this one down here, I still want to learn to speak Spanish fluently. I grew up listening to my aunt's gossip in Spanish. So the extent of my Spanish is gossip, which cracked me up. Okay, and it's something that would be really interesting to research. And if you're interested in doing this, I would be happy to share what works for me and also the challenges with working with TikTok. But emoji use would be really interesting to study. Okay, next one, Spanglish and Spanglish results. Most of these were videos of families with one person teaching the other either Spanish or English. And while many of the comments were very judgmental, most of the appropriateness judgments were mixed between all emergent bilinguals. So it's not just people learning English, it's also people learning Spanish, pretty equally mixed. There was also, which I thought was really cool, a pride in localness and language variation. So this first one, I want some sopita de pollo. I'm feeling enfermita too. And this was a husband and wife. The husband was sick. The wife made him chicken soup. And so the comment was like, I'm feeling a little bit sick too. And this last one here is absolutely my favorite. possibly because I live in West Texas and I go to Albuquerque a lot. But Puertorqueña, what that means is a local from Albuquerque, New Mexico. So this last comment is like, me as a Albuquerquean, una straw, and then the smiling, laughing emoji. So it's not straw, it's a straw. So there's that pride in localness for the Spanglish and Spanglish comments. No sabo kids becomes much more judgmental and harsh, occasionally comical, towards assumed inappropriate use of Spanish in particular. Sometimes though, these teenagers are kind of taking it back and expressing pride in how creative they're using language. This is also a lot of families encouraging kids to translate and accepting those mistakes that happen just with natural language development with different varying levels of support. For example, my sister one time said, "I'm tossing a lot." And I asked her, "Tossing, ¿qué es eso?" And she said, "Tosiendo," which means coughing. And I started laughing. This one is really cool because I assume it's the big sister that posted this. And so tosiendo in Spanish is coughing. This is spelled, I believe, correctly. What's really cool is that S, she knew to double this S when she combined it with the English ing ending. And so this insertion of that lexeme tos with the English ending was really common in the it was more common, I think, in the no sabo kids, which is a really advanced thing to do with language and a creative way to combine that. And this last one was just funny, so I wanted to include it for y'all. I was trying to say, "Don't roll your eyes at me," and I said, "No me roles esos ojos," with all the emojis. And so in my mind, no me roles esos ojos, what that means to me is someone like taking their eyes and rolling them like dice. I don't know if that's right, but that's how I imagine it. So I thought it was funny and I would include it and share it with y'all. Okay, the results for the syntactic levels. The pink is a word or within the word, like tossing, and then the blue is the whole phrase, and then the green is a whole entire sentence. So when it's hashtag translanguaging, remember those comments were very accepting and welcoming and celebratory of these authentic voices. We saw a really even mixture of what type of translanguaging was happening. But whenever we get into the more judgmental comments of Spanglish is Spanglish, and the no sabo kids especially, we see an imbalance, right? So it happens more at the word level and much less often at the sentence level. So when you're working with your students in class, whether it's the pre-service teachers or whether those teachers are working with their students in the ESL classroom or wherever they're teaching, this is something to keep in mind, that if your students feel uncomfortable doing this, you're more likely to see a single word switch. And we saw this in the language autoethnography at Texas Tech. Many of my students, whenever they wrote this, they would even italicize or put quotation marks around that single word switch, almost like they were trying to say, like, "See, I know this is different, this is not standard English, but I'm still going to use it," kind of a thing. All right, moving on. So creating space for authentic voices. I encourage you to take a funds of knowledge approach. Gonzalez et al. 2005, their book Funds of Knowledge was fantastic. It completely changed my perspective as a teacher. So basically, the big takeaway is that emergent bilinguals possess unique linguistic expertise and extensive background knowledge about course content. So whether this is your pre-service teachers who may be like heritage speakers and might not be comfortable using their other language, or to prepare them to move into the classroom, this is an important thing to remember. I need to plug in my laptop. Hang on. All right. Okay. And one way we can do that is when we grade written assignments. Think about the phrasing that you use whenever you grade these assignments. So for our language autoethnography, we have nothing in there about grammar, Nothing about standard academic English. Instead, we grade it based on clear language and carefully edited. And that could mean a lot of different things for different people. What I try to tell my students is that it should be purposeful. Whatever word they choose to use, it just needs to be purposeful and thoughtful. Another way to do this is whenever you have your students storytelling, you might think about doing a self-assessment rubric where you go over the objectives of the activity or the written assignment, whatever it is, beforehand, and share this rubric with them, and then they grade themselves. That way, if you think there is some way they should have used language and they chose a different way to use language in their storytelling, they can defend that and be like, no, this was purposeful. I meant to do this for a reason. So whenever you set these language expectations for whatever activity it is that you're doing, these expectations should provide an entry point for students to play with language and just to be aware of how they play with language. It should also be a foundation for students to analyze the relationship between their awareness of the rhetorical context and their language choices. Like my student Alex was unbelievably amazing at doing this. Not all students are as aware as he is, though. Language expectations should also provide a bridge between students' language practices, their authentic language practices, and the course content. Some takeaways: language expectations should not unintentionally exploit either students or your teachers if you're working with in-service teachers who have already experienced linguistic discrimination in their lives. And this is really important. You don't want to like put, Johnny on the spot because he speaks like super rural, whatever language it is, I don't know. So keep that in mind. Also, these expectations should not come from our own assumptions about how our students should be languaging. And that's what we ran into when we did the pilot of the language autoethnography, is our teachers were like, man, these, students are coming from all over the world, or they're heritage speakers of Spanish. They have these awesome abilities, they should be using them. But these students were protecting themselves, and so we need to respect that. So ultimately, we should respect our students' decisions about both what they feel comfortable sharing, the content, and also how they choose to share it. So those are really the two biggest takeaways, I think, for this whole entire presentation. Here are my sources, and I have one more minute here before Q&A. So thank you so much for your time for listening, whether you're here with us synchronously or whether you're watching later online. I appreciate your time. So what questions do you have?
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. I hope everybody who's watching here live and later, as you said, enjoyed this as much as I did. I love every time we do these webinars. I feel like I have so many light bulbs going off. Yeah, Sheila, Paulina are giving you, hand clapping signals. But anyway, I feel like there's always so many light bulbs that go off for me, and I really appreciate that. I'm going to start us off. One of the questions, and it looks like Arpita maybe had to, oh no, she's still here, sorry. So Arpita asked in, and Arpita, please feel free to unmute if you would like to ask it. But she says, there are also some introvert students who may not feel comfortable sharing a story or, sharing in different languages. I think you talked about this a little bit, but in this case, can storytelling as an activity be appropriate for the students? I wonder if you might talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I love where you're coming from with this question. Like thinking about protecting your students is the most important thing, I think. So the way we did this with the language autoethnography is we provided many different access points to the assignment. And so the first access point was just, think about how you use language with your, maybe with your family compared to your friends. Or, we had a whole lot of athletes. And so we talk about using language differently with coaches versus teammates. And so this is a heavily scaffolded assignment. so that students don't have to share anything until they already have many different ideas to choose from. And so they might choose an idea that's just like super basic, like, when I'm with my coach, I use these, certain words to show respect, but when I'm with my teammates, I, use cuss words, for example. So I think if you provide that scaffolding, and that means like really low stakes opportunities for them to try out their ideas before they share it with the whole entire class. I think that will help reduce that anxiety. Because I definitely understand a lot of students have that anxiety when they're sharing with the whole class. My favorite way to do that is just a basic think, pair, share, where I have students with a partner, like a single partner. I let them choose where they sit. In college classes, that's easier to do, but I let them choose where they sit. They get to choose their partner. So they have someone that they at least somewhat feel comfortable with, telling these stories and practicing these ideas before they have to share with everybody. And I also tell them, we're not going to know if it's true or not, just make it sound true. So if they have nothing they feel comfortable sharing, they can totally make something up. And that's okay too.
Thank you. That's great, Elizabeth. Yeah, and Arpita mentioned she's in Bangladesh with large crowded classrooms, so maybe that think, pair, share works well in that kind of setting as well. Yeah. Other questions that folks have or comments, feel free to unmute, turn your camera on if you want to. I'll pause for a minute, let folks ask if they'd like.
Elizabeth, I thought it was a really wonderful presentation. Nice, great to see you again. Thanks so much for doing this for us. It's really wonderful to hear you. I just wondered maybe you could speak a little bit more about your initial motivation on this research. I know that you did initially, but I wanted to hear more about where you came into this from and what motivated you to get interested in this topic, and maybe what preceded this that led to this.
Yeah, fantastic question. I could talk about that forever. I will try not to and respect your time. Right, so going back to being in this rural Texas high school ESL classroom, students were very comfortable with me. I loved just hearing them talk to each other, whether it was on cooperative assignments or those really low-key moments in the classroom, like before class started, or like when they were finished with their work, about to move to the next thing, and they were just chatting with each other. And I noticed they were all doing really cool things with language, with the way they were mixing it. And they were all very comfortable with each other. Most of them had grown up together. And so in that really unfiltered moment, all those unfiltered moments in the classroom, I could tell they were doing really advanced things with language, but I couldn't put words into explaining exactly what they were doing. It was so cool and so advanced. And then yet I would go into, a staff meeting or a meeting with some of the administrators who, typically framed these students as being languageless, not fluent in English and not fluent in Spanish because we had no bilingual, funding. And so that's really what prompted me to start looking at why these language ideologies of why from one perspective they have no language, and then why from another perspective they're like really gifted at languaging. So that's originally what prompted me to study linguistics at Tech to begin with, especially translanguaging or code switching, meshing, whatever you want to call it, and the syntax, like the little bits and pieces and how they fit together, because I felt like that's really where that giftedness was like coming into play. And so I had this idea coming to Tech, thinking like they're changing what they're doing. And we all do this, we all change how we language and how we mesh together varieties of languages, depending on the situation. And then whenever we were doing this language autoethnography, I kind of knew that the students would be hesitant to train language in writing in this very formal, college setting. And then when working with our teachers who also wrote the same thing to share with their students, even more anxieties were coming into play about this. And so I was really curious about when the situation changes, when the judgments change, how does that really affect the language use? And at first I looked at just the regular corpora that are out there. There are a lot in Texas, like Spanish in Texas corpus from UT is one of them, but still it's that setting, that very formal setting of being with an interviewer in a college situation. I felt like that natural language wasn't coming out as much as it could have. So I thought, like, where are people talking to each other and like totally, not concerned about how they sound too much, And so then I saw Dr. Jose Medina on Twitter, actually, and then linked to TikTok. And I was like, that is exactly what I'm looking for. And so I started, digging into what he was posting and speaking about. And that's where I really fell into social media discourse. From the perspective of composition studies, it's people communicating and writing with each other. And there's storytelling involved, so much in social media. A very specific type of storytelling in TikTok too, that multimodal storytelling with a very limited time frame. That also adds like wonderful complexity to the whole thing. So that's where I am now, researching with social media, trying to use social media as a type of corpus, like linguistic corpus. But there are challenges too, of course, mainly the vast amounts of data and how to sort it. So if anyone has any ideas, by the way, that's where I'm stuck right now with my dissertation research, is how to pull comments on social media that are specifically like have more than one language within the comment. Apify, it made it easier, but it's still too much. Yeah, so if anyone has any ideas on that, or if you're watching online and you have an idea, email me please, or post it in the comments.
Great.
Oh, James, I think you were muted. Did you have another comment? Oh yeah, you're muted. Sorry, you're muted. We still don't hear you.
Thank you very much. That was all I was saying was just thanks for the answer. I guess
Sure,
I
you're
was hitting unmute when I thought I was hitting mute. So I guess I was not muted the entire time. I thought I was. Sorry.
All
Thank
good.
you.
All good. Yeah, Elizabeth, that's great. It really made me think about how with translanguaging, and to a certain extent, I think with telling stories, students, people have learned their whole lives, like, I keep my languages. I do language this way here, and I do language this way in this other space. And in a classroom, when we're asking them to translanguage, it really is something revolutionary. We're asking them to break what they've been taught, the rules that they've been taught from the beginning. All right.
And they might not feel comfortable with it, and that's okay.
Right. So Ray also has a comment. You may be breaking ground here, so you'll have to share what you find out about those methods. And congrats on your official PhD candidacy. Yeah, I agree. I can't believe, Elizabeth, that you had 68,000 comments.
I did not look at all of those. I just looked at the top 5
Oh,
because I did that math too. And I was like, there's no way I can do that.
I just can't even imagine.
But I looked at the top 5 videos under each post. Yeah, thank you, Ray, for your comment. Groundbreaking methods are awesome, but they're really hard. Because no one, or I can't find anyone who knows how to do this in an easier way. Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that, but it makes it difficult for sure. But no, the scholars that are doing this really awesome work, Suresh Kanagaraja in the rhetorical rhetoric studies side of it is absolutely fantastic. And then of course, Nelson Flores and Jonathan Rosa and Ophelia Garcia, all of the rock stars, they changed how I look at education for sure. And they changed how I work with my students in the classroom, now at the college level and before at the high school and middle school level. Before, I had been taught that, especially in my first few years teaching, I had been trained that students in the ESL program are there for remediation. And so there was something like lacking, is that deficit perspective, and also that they did not have background knowledge to access the content with. And so it was my job to help them create that background knowledge. At the time, it made sense, because, these students need help. And so I'm there to help them. But as I got to know the students more, my first 2 years teaching were in Dallas. And then I transferred to the rural district on the northern edge of the Metroplex. And so whenever I transferred to this rural district, most of the students were the children of the ranch hands on the horse ranches out there. So they had grown up there together. They never considered English as their second language or Spanish as their second language. It was just their language. And I had students who was like, why are you in this program? Like, we're having this, really, awesome, complicated conversation in English, and they did fine. And I remember my very first year teaching, I had an 8th grade student. I was like, there's no way you're going to be in here next year. You're going to exit. And sure enough, he was there all the way until his senior year. And it has more to do with the exit requirements in Texas, has more to do with written academic language than it does with actual English, which is important to be sure. It's just that I always thought, like, whose grammar are we teaching exactly? So that's where I'm coming from. Yeah. Yeah, ratiolinguistics. Ray, I'm glad you brought that term up. Data from Reddit. Okay, cool. I'm going to click on this link. Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, great comment.
Yeah, I might contact him and ask, how did you do this?
Elizabeth, while you were talking to, I don't know if this is too far in left field, but when you looked at those posts or comments or whatever, and you were looking at what type of translanguaging you were seeing, was it word level, phrase level, or sentence level?
Mm-hmm.
I work with pre-service teachers at my university, some of whom will be ESL teachers, but a lot of whom will not be. And so when we talk about how can you bring students other languages into the classroom, they exclusively think at the word level.
Mm.
And I also think when we're talking about supporting students, supporting multilingual learners, everybody thinks about vocabulary, but to get beyond that, I think has been a challenge for supporting students, for thinking about translanguaging. And so I think that is also a really interesting finding from your research, that the translanguaging that's happening out there probably is linked to the attitude towards translanguaging.
Right.
So sort of how deep it gets, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that was super interesting to me as well.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, I had also heard, they need academic vocabulary, teach that vocabulary. I heard it called brick and mortar, where it's like, imagine a brick wall, and those academic terms are the bricks, and then all the stuff in between, the mortar, the connecting words. We don't think about it, but students need those connecting words just as much as the bricks. So like, how to put it all together is really what we should be focusing on, not just teach academic vocabulary. Yeah. And something to note at Texas Tech, we have a lot of bilingual, multilingual students, a lot of heritage speakers, but we also have a lot of English monolingual, they consider themselves monolingual speakers. And so the storytelling about, like, it's a story about their language and how they change languages, even when they're monolingual, that does start to break down those socially reinforced boundaries between languages. Because all of a sudden, we have a student from a cotton farm out in, the middle of nowhere, West Texas. She's like, oh yeah, I do change how I talk here at the university compared to back home. And then it was really fun getting them to talk about the different dialects they were bringing into the classroom from where they were from. Yeah, so that was really cool. It is good for all students, but best for students who are traditionally minoritized because of the languages, because suddenly here they have a strength that other students might not have, and it's framed as a strength. So yeah. Okay, what else?
Got about 5 minutes left. If anybody else has a comment or a question, be happy to hear it.
I don't know if this is true of where everyone else is from, but in Texas especially, our students who are second and third generation, they remember their grandparents being like beat at school for speaking in Spanish. And so that kind of generational trauma of that, it lasts and it sticks with them. And so that's, I say like they might be making a safe choice, but there might be a very real reason why they're making that choice that we definitely need to be aware of. So throwing that out there. I don't know if it's true everywhere, but in Texas, this is a major issue. Yeah.
There are definitely stories just like that for Francophone Quebecois who came into Maine and New Hampshire and Vermont. Exactly the same thing. And
Yeah.
earlier probably, but the same thing, yeah.
And when I've talked to teachers in Wisconsin and I talk about how kids can be discouraged from speaking other languages in the classroom, everybody will say, yeah, there's a teacher down the hall that tells them to only speak English. I mean, that's not beating, obviously, a very, much less punishment, but still they're being, in many cases here, they're being told explicitly only speak English. Yeah.
It's still happening. Maybe not quite so physically violent, but occasionally, like in Texas, there are still some schools that practice corporal punishment, but not that many. But it's definitely still a thing. I'm thinking of our indigenous languages also. Monica, I had a student come from a neighboring district that was farther out to the country, and he transferred into our district because the principal had called his mom asking her to sign the form for him to be paddled because he refused to stop speaking in Spanish. Thankfully, his mom is like a total badass, and she got mad at the principal and knew that she could pull him out of that school and come to a different district.
It makes our advocacy efforts all the more necessary, right?
Definitely. And at universities, private language schools too, we see other ways that this is happening. In Texas, students who do not exit ESL end up in TEIS, I think. I forgot the acronym. There's so many acronyms, but basically they have to enroll in another English class to help support them in the English 1301 and 1301 or 1301 and 1302 classes, but that's money. It's very expensive, and they're having to pay for this additional class. And it's not always effective. I'll say that. Okay.
Well, Elizabeth and everyone, thank you so much for joining us today for this fascinating conversation. I think it really took us in a lot of different directions, but in ways that are really not only interesting to us as teacher educators, but also really important. And so, Elizabeth, we really appreciate you taking your time to share. Good luck finishing up that dissertation. We'll be looking for those positive words from you very soon, or no pressure, right? We'll be hoping for the positive news someday soon. But to everyone, thank you so much. Please be on the lookout for our next teacher educator interest section. If you're not on the new My TESOL, hopefully you all will be soon. Hopefully it'll be up and running soon, and we will look forward to seeing you all again. So thank you.